I'm Rick Sinding. It's March 28th, 2013, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. As part of the Center on the American Governor at Eagleton, we're interviewing today with Steve Perskie, who has a unique experience of serving in all three branches of New Jersey state government, including a stint as the Chief of Staff to Governor Jim Florio. Welcome, Steve.
Nice to be here.
You have the unique experience of having served in all three branches of New Jersey state government. Elected to the Assembly at the ripe old age of 26, I believe, in 1971.
Sworn in on my 27th birthday.
Then serving 3 terms in the Assembly, moving up to the Senate for a term before being appointed as a Superior Court judge, and serving, I guess, 8 years in that position.
About 7.5 years.
And then coming back into government, this time in the executive branch as the Chief of Staff to Governor Florio, then being appointed as the chair of the Casino Control Commission. So you have, again, as I said, this unique experience. Let's talk a little about about your earliest encounters with Jim Florio, which I assume must have been in the Assembly.
Indeed.
In the early 70s.
Jim and I met. I was elected in November of 71. And immediately thereafter, there was a meeting convened of all of the newly elected Democrats in the Assembly, because there were 40 of us, which was a very interesting number in those days, as you may remember. And it was at that meeting that I met Jim Florio and his colleague John Horn, who I later obviously got to do a lot of work with. And I spent 3 years in the Assembly with Jim, 72, 73, 74, before he left to go to Washington.
And tell me about that period. What was your impression of him as a legislator? And did you see him at that time as a potential governor some decades later?
Not specifically. Actually, he and I at that point had relatively little contact. It was all pleasant, but our interests were different. He was on different committees than I was. He had run unsuccessfully for Congress in 1972. I think it was 72 or 70. I think it was 72. So it was clear to all of us that his main focus was to attempt again to go to Congress. We worked together on issues, those few issues, like, for example, anything having to do with South Jersey or the environment or anything of that nature. But most of the time our interests were not all that parallel.
So how was it that, well, let's see, 1974, 1989, 15 years later, he came to you, or I assume he came to you and not vice versa, and asked to be part of his administration?
Well, there were a number of things that happened along the way. He ran for governor in the primary in 77, I think, and I was allied with Governor Byrne. So we had a cordial, we spoke about that at the time, and it was cordial, but he understood that I wasn't going to be able to help him in the primary. Then in 1981, he ran in the primary again and asked me for my help. I couldn't help him either, although I wished him well, because I had a very close personal and political relationship with Joe Merlino, who was running for governor in that primary. I felt an obligation and a willingness to try to help Joe, and I did.
He was the Senate president at the time, and you were serving in the Senate.
Correct, and that's true, but even beyond that, when I was in the Assembly, he and I had developed a very, very good personal and political relationship. I trusted him, I liked him, he helped me. He was the only member of the Senate in 1977. If you remember, in 77, I ran for the Senate against the incumbent Democrat, who had by then chosen to run as an independent. So it would normally have been expected that I would have been entitled to the support of the Democrats in the Senate. But because of their personal relationships with Joe McGahn, they all took a walk, but Joe Merlino did not. Joe Merlino was the only member of the Senate Democratic Caucus to come down and try to help me win that election.
Without going into too much detail about this, because it's a lot of sort of inside baseball, how was it that you and Joe McGahn had been allied in your first campaign, and then some years later you ended up being political foes?
That probably takes a lot more time than you want to spend today, but the synopsis, I guess, of it is that we grew apart both in terms of political perspective as well as personal collegiality. There was an intervening factor. Joe had a brother, Pat, who was his political guru, if you will, and who managed all of the political side of the process. Pat and I After a decent beginning in our relationship, it didn't work well. I had developed a very close personal and political relationship with the governor, Governor Byrne. From Pat's point of view, that deprived him, Pat, and by inference Joe, of the status that they thought they wanted to have as the lead figures, if you will, locally. I wasn't interested in that. I was just interested in getting a job done. And Brendan Byrne and I had developed a terrific personal and working relationship from the very beginning. So all of that combined after a while to make coexistence between me and Pat McGann impossible. In 1975, when the Assembly was on the ballot and the Senate was not, Pat made a concerted effort to make sure I would not be reelected. Almost succeeded. I only won that election by a few hundred votes. And then by 77, after the gaming referendum had passed, and the avenue for really accomplishing big things for our district was wide open, the choice that I faced was either to live the next 4 years fighting those battles every day or just try to deal with them all at once. So I tried to deal with them all at once. In any event, back to Florio. Now in 1981, I can't help him again in the primary, but he won that primary. And from my point of view, although I was disappointed personally for Joe Merlino, whom I really liked and who would have been a very good governor, from a political point of view, having Jim Florio at the head of the ticket in 1981 was manna from heaven for me. I was facing
a South Jersey Democrat.
Sure, and very popular and well known in Atlantic County. I was facing another contest with McGann. This time, by now, McGann had converted and had become a Republican for the purpose of making sure I didn't get reelected. So Jim Florio's candidacy in 1981 was very, very welcome.
That was a very close race, too.
It was indeed. Well, for my race.
Race.
Jim's race was not.
Was even closer at a statewide level, but not in Atlantic County.
That's exactly right. In Atlantic County, Jim won handily. I won, but not as handily. Mm-hmm. And I was disappointed that he didn't get elected in 81. But Tom Kane, who was elected in 81, was not a political friend, but he was a personal, we were very easy personally. We had a very warm personal relationship.
From your time together in the Assembly?
From the time that we served in the Assembly, politically and personally, we just got along. We didn't always vote together. He didn't vote for casino gambling. We had a lot of trouble with some of the tax initiatives. But he was very easy to work with, a very comfortable relationship.
This was an era in which collegiality within the legislature was quite a bit different than it is today.
It bears no resemblance to the world today, and that causes me more pain than you can possibly imagine. I can't even bother to invest and watch closely what used to be my life's interest, either in Washington or in Trenton, because the manner in which business is done these days, or more accurately, not done, reflects a sea change in the nature of the process. When I served in the 1970s and even into the 80s, you could fight policy-wise all day with people, and we did, and then go to Lorenzo's here and have dinner.
The former Lorenzo's.
The former, I just heard
the late lamented Lorenzo's.
Indeed lamented, indeed. But any number of evenings I spent there in cordial relationships with my political adversaries, making deals, principled policy deals. That's how you got business done in those days, because you weren't worried as much as they are today about making sure the other guy failed. My sense of it, watching what's going on in Washington and Trenton today, is that people are more interested in making sure that the other guy doesn't succeed in what he wants than in accomplishing something of their own. And I blame both parties and the process for that. But it wasn't that way then. When I served in the legislature in the 70s and into the 80s, you could, and we did, establish very effective, cordial relationships across the aisle that led on occasion to the kind of policy-making compromises that resulted in some very, very good legislation.
Having fought so hard to get that 1981 Senate seat, what prompted you very shortly thereafter to accept a position to the court?
I had concluded during the course of that 1981 campaign that I had run for the wrong reason. That's a shorthand answer to your question. The longer answer is that there were a couple of factors that persuaded me even before that election that I would not run again, in no particular order of significance. In order to run against McGahn in that election, I thought one of the techniques that I thought would be effective was to go back for the 3 campaigns that we had each run before, take a look at what we had promised the people that we would do, and then take a look at what we had accomplished, with my purpose being to show that everything that I had said that I was going to do, I had done, whereas things that he had said he was going to do, he hadn't done. And we were able to do that, and we ran some very effective ads for that. But the cost to me was to look at this and say, hey, wait a minute. Everything that I have ever told the people I wanted to do, I've already done. Why am I running? What else do I want to do? And the answer I reached for myself was that the only reason I was running was to keep McGahn from winning. And that realization bothered me greatly. And then in the course of that 1981 campaign, which I knew from the beginning was going to be difficult, I hired some very, very capable professionals from New York, one of whom has now gone on to an international reputation, as he was a young guy at the time. And he came to see me, did his polling, did his research, came in to see me in July and laid out for me the kind of campaign that was going to be run against me, which was generically a very negative campaign. They were going to attack me and my character and my family and whatever. And I said, okay, so? He said, that's going to be very effective. You could lose. I said, well, what do I have to do? He says, you got to go negative, and you got to go negative before he does, and you got to go negative more aggressively than he does. Advice that I did not want to accept, but under the circumstances, basically, I concluded I had no choice. So that's what I did. And we ran in 1981, the exact opposite of the campaign I had run 4 years before. In 1977, running against McGahn as the incumbent, he was the incumbent, I ran a purely positive campaign. This is what I didn't attack McGahn at all. This is what I want to accomplish. This is what I've done. This is what I want to do. It was a beautiful campaign. It was fun. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I got elected. But 4 years later, you couldn't do it that way. 4 years later, as the incumbent, I was on the defense. So I got into the gutter with them, and we slugged it out, and I won, and I promised everybody close to me, my family, my immediate supporters, never going to do this again. Didn't tell the public that because I wanted to be effective for the next 2 years. And then 6 months later, a judge who was up for reappointment in his early 60s called me up and he said, I'd like to come see you. And so I went to see the judge. Wouldn't let a judge come to see me. And he said, I just want to give you the courtesy of telling you tomorrow I'm going to announce my resignation. I'm moving to Florida. And my seat will be open, which was not anticipated. Okay.
Did he bring this to your attention because he thought you might be interested?
Not at
or
all.
Because you were the senator?
Yes. No, he brought it to my attention. He was an old friend of the family, and he brought it to my attention simply as a courtesy. He had no idea. In fact, what happened, the next weekend, I went to dinner with my closest friend, personal closest friend, and our wives, and we were talking about it, and I was going over with my friend the list of names that I had in my mind for lawyers to succeed to take this vacancy. And Howard looked at me and he said, I have to clean it up for this, but he said, what's wrong with you? I said, what do you mean? And he looked at me and he says, are you serious? I said, yeah, what are you talking about? He said, you're going to run again next year? I said, no, you know that. You want to be a judge someday? Yeah. Take the seat. Now, it's probable that the idea would have occurred to me at some point, but it hadn't by then, because here I was after 10 years, driving an agenda. I was majority leader of the Senate. I was dealing with the governor's tax program. A lot of things on my mind. Immediately at 37 years of age, being a judge at that point was not what I had in mind. I knew I wasn't going to run again the next year, but I hadn't thought about anything other than practicing law after that, other than in the very back of my mind, always knowing that someday I would want to be a judge. Well, okay, so by the next day, that idea had germinated, and I went in to see Tom Kane, and he said, sure. So I became a judge. Now we're still trying to get to Florida. So now it's 1982, I'm a judge. I spent the next 7 years happy as a clam. I really loved being a judge. A problem had developed towards the end of that time, in the late 80s, in that I had sort of concluded that as much as I liked the job, I was heading for a problem because I didn't, my sons at that point were in their teens. They were going to be going to college in the early 90s. And I had not done a very good job over the years of long-term financial planning. So in the back of my mind, I sort of had an idea that at some point I might have to quit the judgeship to go and earn some money. But it was a sort of an unformed idea. In any event, somewhere around 1988, 88, that's right, my wife and I went to a theater in Philadelphia one night and literally bumped into an old friend of mine from Camden that I knew well, a political figure, a lawyer. And, hey, how you doing? How you been? He says, I was just talking about you last week. Talking to Jim Florio. You know he's running. Everybody knew he was running the next year. And he said, I told him that he ought to talk to you about getting involved in the campaign. I said, I can't get involved in the campaign. I said, I'm a judge. I can't do anything like that. He said, I know that. He said, but I'm thinking about after the election. So one thing led to another, and Jim Florio and I had then, still do, a lot of mutual friends. And we got together for dinner with one of the mutual friends. The six of us went to dinner. This would have been in the summer or early fall of 1988. And he said to me, Florio said to me, is there any chance that you would leave the bench and come to work if I get elected? And I said, yeah. The answer was yes. We didn't talk about anything specific. We didn't talk about chief of staff or this job or that job. It was just a sort of general kind of background kind of inquiry. And what can I do for you in the meantime? There's nothing I can do for you politically. I'm on the bench. I can't leave the bench. I have no place to go. And I certainly can't get involved in politics. Is anything that you look? He said, I might have some questions from time to time that I would maybe ask you to research for me and give me some thoughts. I said, we can do that. So we arranged with the other fellow that was at dinner that night, who was a lawyer in South Jersey, that we could communicate through him. And once in a while, I would get a phone call or a note from the other guy. What do you think about this? What do you think about that?
Would these be policy areas?
Yeah, all policy. Well, until the end, all policy. Then what happened, and I would write a memo addressed to Carl.
Van Horn.
And Carl would get, no, another Carl.
Oh, I'm sorry.
and Carl would get it to Florio, and then I'd get back, well, what do you think about, and so we would communicate through, and then maybe...
Can you give us a couple of examples of the types of issues that he was interested in?
Environment questions at that point. I think there was one on criminal law. I don't remember the specific details. Also, there was a question. There were some people in Camden County that were looking at the possibility of a charter change to install a county executive form of government, and Jim knew that I had a lot of experience with that. Had written part of the statute from Atlantic.
Yeah.
Things of that nature. Then, in the spring, now it's the spring of '89. He's involved in the primary. And he's doing very well. And I get asked one day to do some research in terms of the structure, the possibilities for the structure of the governor's office. How should it be organized? How can it most effectively be done? That's a much bigger assignment. Now, as it happened, I was up for reappointment to the court. So I had to come to Trenton one day anyway to go to the Senate Judiciary Committee for my interview. While I was in the State House, I went to see a friend of mine who was in the Legislative Services Agency, one of the staff people, and asked him if he would help me collect research on how gubernatorial offices had initially been organized in new administrations, transition systems and whatnot. That's another good memory that I haven't thought of in a long time. He was close enough to me not to bother to ask me why I wanted all that information, and smart enough to know why you have figured it out on his own. And later on, at the end of the year when I came back as director of transition, and I literally bumped into him in the hall in the State House. He says, "I thought I'd see you." Any event, he and I together did a lot of research. We looked into how the Kane administration had organized itself in 1981. We looked into how the Byrne administration had organized itself in 1973.
Prior to Kane, there hadn't really been very much organization in the governor's office, right?
Correct. But I had watched Brendan Byrne do it through Dick Leone, and I had watched Tom Kane do it through Debbie Poritz and Lou Thurston and whatnot. So I had some sense of what might be involved, but it was all from a distance. Now I had to really get into it and figure it out and be in a position to make some suggestions to him, both with respect to how the transition period from November to January would work, and then also how the governor's office itself should be organized and structured to start a new administration. And that's in fact significantly affected, or at least I believed and he believed that it should be, by what the agenda was. And if you'll remember, when the time he got elected, there were some compelling immediate interests. There was the automobile insurance issue, there was the budget deficit issue, there was the gun issue, there were a number of education funding issues. All of these things we knew were going to come to a head immediately after he took the oath.
And we'll talk about each of these.
Okay. So we had to structure a system that would be prepared to deal with all that. So I spent June, July, into August, thinking those things through, making memos, sending them to him through third party and whatnot. And by this time...
By this time, he's the candidate.
He's won the primary. Not only had he won the primary, now another problem developed that neither he nor I anticipated. It was always my intention, which he clearly knew, that I would stay on the bench through at least the election, and that after that, if he wanted, it was entirely his call, if he wanted to invite me in a position, I would be prepared to accept it. But if he didn't, that would be fine too, and I would stay on the bench. That was our understanding. Well, that was only good until about early August, because by early August, he was so far ahead in the polls and so far ahead in the expectations of his staff and organization that he would be elected, that he called me up one day to tell me he had a problem. What's your problem? And nobody in his entire campaign knew anything about me. And that's how he and I both wanted it. That was also very explicitly, because I had responsibilities to the judiciary, and it could not be perceived that I was actively playing any role in the campaign. All I was really doing was serving as a think tank and advisor to him. But by this time, his staff is saying to him, Congressman, you're going to win this election in a few months. You've got to start thinking about how to organize your office. You've got to start thinking about how to run a transition. You've got to start thinking about all these things that he had already been thinking about but hadn't told them. Mm-hmm. So he said, I need you to do me a favor. What's that? He says, I've got a guy in the campaign that I trust, that I believe is trustworthy. I want to send him, with your permission, I want to send him to see you. I want you to tell him everything you've been doing, and you keep doing what you've been doing, except that this time you'll do it through him, and he'll do it. As far as the rest of my organization is concerned, he'll be the one that's doing it. Well, that was all right with me, so that's how I met Angelo Genova, whom I had not known before, but whom I have come to...
I was going to say, you two probably hit it off right away.
From the first minute. I think the world of him. Came to see me at my house. We sat out on the deck one beautiful August day. I gave him all the memos that I had done. I told him where I was thinking. I told him where I thought the transition and the structure of the governor's office at that point should be going. And he picked it all up. And as far as the rest of the Florio campaign organization was concerned, he was doing all of this. And anytime he had a question, he would call me, and it worked fine for about 4 or 5 weeks. Now it's Labor Day, or shortly thereafter, and instead of being 10 points ahead in the polls, he's 15 points ahead in the polls. And now a whole lot of the people in his organization are coming to him and asking him about who's going to be doing what. Okay, Angelo's working on a transition system, but who's going to be this and who's going to be that and what's my role, and questions he couldn't begin directly to answer. he needed somebody to be in a position to answer them. So I got another call. Okay. By that time, my die was cast. First of all, I believed he was going to win the election. But even if he didn't, in the back of my mind, leaving the bench was, while I very much enjoyed being a judge and would have, in an ideal circumstance, been willing to stay there for the rest of my career, I knew somewhere along the line I was going to have to leave anyway for financial reasons. So, okay, fine. I will leave the bench.
Not that going into the executive branch was going to make you rich.
No, but it would provide me with a challenge. I mean, the opportunity was nobody with my DNA says no to a governor who says come in and join my administration in an important position.
Right.
Not going to happen. If I had to, whatever I had to do. In any event, I left. I retired from the bench. I think it was the 3rd or 4th of October, or something like that. And I announced that I would be joining the Florio campaign as an advisor, which didn't fool and wasn't intended to fool anybody. It was designed to provide, Florio didn't want to be in a position, and I didn't want him to be in a position where it looked to the outside world like he was taking the election for granted and was already talking about how to organize his administration.
Yet it was widely known among political people that that was your role.
Well, sure, because nobody in the campaign thought that I could contribute anything. Now, as it turned out, I have told Florio this and Doug Berman on a number of occasions. On the day that I resigned from the bench, Florio was ahead by 15 points. He won the election a month later by 20 points. Those 5 points were mine. In any event, I left and I became an advisor. I opened up an office in Atlantic City that it was about 1/3 the size of this room that we're sitting in. And I put
I should point out, since the camera doesn't move, that this is not a large room.
Very small, one-person office, one desk, one telephone, one lamp. That was the office. And the telephone started to ring. And I spent the next month following up on all the things I had started with, getting the congressman to pretty much closure on how he wanted the transition organized, how he anticipated at that point the governor's office would be organized, so that we could begin to think about, okay, Rick Sinding comes in to talk about a role. Well,
For example.
And I spent the next month working with people, most of whom I didn't know, but all of whom I immediately concluded, wow, I was in a group of extraordinarily talented people. And after the election, the day after the election, I was named director of the transition, because by that time, Jim and I had concluded, there was a discussion, should I be Attorney General, should I be counsel to the governor, should I be chief of staff, should there be something else? We never had any specific focus on that until after the election. After the election, during the transition, we sort of morphed into the idea that chief of staff would be the best place for me to be, because my principal role was going to be as chief legislative liaison. Mm-hmm. That was really the main mission I was going to assume. And counsel to the governor would have permitted that, but chief of staff permitted it in a different context.
Well, it also allowed you to follow up on the structural issues that you were dealing with.
Absolutely. So after the election, I was designated as director of transition. And
before we get to that, yeah, I want to ask you one question about the campaign, because it stuck with me after reading the transcripts of some of your earlier interviews as part of this project. In 1971, you cast a very controversial vote in favor of an income tax that was proposed. 72. That was proposed by a Republican governor.
Cahill.
And you did this from the vantage point of serving on the taxation committee, having studied tax law, being somewhat of a legislative expert on tax issues and tax policy. You had and then in 1973, when Brendan Byrne got the nomination, and you were running for re-election to the Assembly, you were disappointed, is the word that you used. I suspect the word was maybe a little stronger, your feeling, when Brendan Byrne said in the campaign that he saw no need for an income tax in the foreseeable future. and this caused you a lot of consternation in your own campaign, but you all got through that, and in the mid-'70s, you were deeply and heavily involved in the in getting the first income tax passed. Now, fast forward to 1989, Jim Florio is leading by 10, 15, 20 points, and he says sometime during this campaign, I don't recall exactly when, that he saw no need to raise taxes. Were you chagrined, disappointed, upset, bothered? I mean, I posed this question to Carl Van Horn. I remember writing as a journalist in 1989 that there were two things that were absolutely certain about the 1989 election. That the next governor was going to be a former congressman named Jim, and that one of the first things he was going to do was going to be to raise taxes. It was absolutely known that there was a structural deficit, that the deficit that the Kane administration was talking about was far worse than that. And Jim Florio had said during the campaign that he saw no need to raise taxes. Would history have worked out a bit differently had he not said that? And how did you feel coming into an administration knowing that the governor-elect had said that as a candidate?
Let me answer the question with a preface that is meant to put my real answer in context. In 1990, in fact, in December of 1989, immediately after the election, he and we, at his behest, set about to fashion the agenda that you saw enacted in 1990, when he told the people of New Jersey what I considered then and now to be the absolute truth, and when he took the very difficult political steps that eventually, 4 years later, cost him his re-election and won him, justifiably in my opinion, a Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy Institute. All that was ahead. I mention it only to point out that the man had the courage of his convictions, and when the time came to do what had to be done, he did it, and he did it unhesitatingly. That having been said, was I disappointed in 1989? Sure I was. But my disappointment, remember, was cheap. I was sitting in a secure seat. I had just been reappointed by the governor and approved by the Senate for a lifetime tenure as a Superior Court judge. I had no political exposure whatsoever. I could spend the rest of my life until the age of 70 on the public payroll doing a job that I loved at no risk. So it occurred to me then, as it still does, that while I would have preferred intellectually, and in my cheap opinion politically, that my candidate for governor would have gone out there, as did Brendan Byrne in 1977 when he ran for re-election and defended what he had done, but had not done either in 73. I would have preferred that they told what I thought was the truth. But you didn't see that then. You surely don't see it now. You see even less of the truth being told now. I could fault Brendan Byrne for his statement in 1973 intellectually, and I do. I could fault Jim Florio in 1989, and I do. But the truth is that when each of them got elected, he did what he had to do, and he did it well.
I guess let me reiterate the bottom line question in a different way, however, and that is, if he had not said what he said,
would he have been reelected? Would he have been elected?
Would getting the tax package through in 1990 have been any easier?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Well, and subsequently, would his reelection?
Well, let's take that in pieces. The first question is, if he had said in the election campaign in '89 exactly what he said in January and February of '90. First question is, would he have been elected? Mm-hmm. And it's easy all these years later to say, oh, sure, okay, because he was elected so handily, and the timing and the process were so right. But that's 20/20 hindsight, which is always perfect vision. And while I believe today, and I think probably most people would tell you today that if he had done that then, he probably would have been elected, might certainly not have looked that way in August and September and October of 1989. That's the first answer to your question. Now, let's assume that he had done that. Would it have been easier? Sure. It would have been easier because you go to the legislature, newly elected in 1990, and you say, look, the people have already voted on this. The proof of that, by the way, there's one tiny vote that a lot of people have forgotten that makes that point. When, in 1976, when Byrne finally did get the tax program through, a very difficult Senate, the Senate, in a vote that I abhorred at the time and have later come to concede was genius, the Senate insisted, through the Senator Musto, on adding a provision that the program would sunset automatically, would expire in December of 1977. A position which at the time I felt was absolutely outrageous, but turns out to have been, in my view, a crucially important political device, because it forced the candidates in the 77 gubernatorial and legislative elections to answer with some degree of specificity, what are you going to do on January 1st, 1978, when the taxes that you imposed last year expire? And that, we're not here to talk about the Bateman-Simon plan and that Brendan Byrne referred to in Atlantic City as having recently become known by its initials, but that in fact was what forced that election to focus on the two various answers to that question. And then, this is the vote that most people have forgotten. November 1977, Brendan Byrne is re-elected. 2 weeks later, on page 37 of most of the newspapers, the legislature voted nearly unanimously to repeal the repealer, so that the December 31st, 1977 repeal date was canceled. And it was a non-event. Nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to it because everybody concluded that the election had decided the issue. Well, if Florio had campaigned in '89 that way, you could have gone to the Assembly and to the Senate in the spring of 1990 and said, people have already voted on this.
We could probably spend the rest of our allotted time talking about the parallels between that and the expiration of the Bush tax cuts.
Yes.
But let's not. Let's move along to Inauguration Day, 1990. You have now been appointed as the Chief of Staff. You all hit the ground running, and you hit it running hard.
Yes.
And I guess one of the first questions, one of the questions we like to ask everyone involved in the inner circle of the governor's office at that time is, when you mapped out the strategies for auto insurance reform, assault weapons ban, attacking the budget deficit, and education funding, all sort of within the 2 or 3 months, you knew, everybody in the front office knew, actually everybody around the State House knew, that this was Jim Florio spending the political capital right away.
Absolutely.
Just going ahead and doing it.
And that was a calculated decision.
It was.
Absolutely.
Was it a unanimous decision
No,
among all of them? It was not.
No, absolutely not. Well, it was a unanimous. It was almost unanimous within the governor's inner circle. Brenda Bacon, Doug Berman, Carl Van Horn. And the Assembly leadership was on board to an almost complete extent. The Senate leadership was much more reserved and much more willing and would have much preferred to defer as long as possible many of these decisions. You have to remember the political dynamic. This was a 1989 election in which both houses were up, and the election, no, I'm sorry, 89 was just the Assembly. In 1990, there was no election for the legislature, but 91, the next year, was going to be for both houses. And you could look at that two different ways in terms of how to pace what you were going to do for difficult decisions. And the Assembly leadership agreed with the governor's people that you get this stuff out of the way as early as possible so that you have as much time as possible thereafter to deal with the political consequences. The Senate leadership would have preferred it otherwise. So we had a lot of problems in that regard with respect to the pacing of the agenda, principally with respect to the issues of education, finance, and the budget. Mm-hmm. The automobile insurance and the gun bill were universally perceived among all of our constituencies. The Democratic House Senate leadership, the Democratic Assembly leadership, and the governor's people all understood and agreed that right out of the gate you do auto insurance and you do assault weapons.
And the assault weapons, interestingly enough, it may have had more to do with costing Jim Florio his re-election 4 years later and costing a lot of the Assembly and Senate members their seats 2 years later than anything else.
I know that that's some of the prevailing wisdom. I'm not sure I agree with it at all. I think that, I thought then, still do, that the political fault that was and is and should be attributed to us with respect, we did, in my view now as it was then, we did some wonderful and very right things. We didn't do them very well politically. Principally because we addressed and solved quickly and completely a whole number of problems that the public really didn't fully appreciate were problems at all or what the extent of the problems were. And that was because we didn't do a terrific job, we didn't do a very good job at all of speaking to the public and explaining why we had to do what we believed that we had to do. But in terms of the impact, yes, the gun bill got a very loud and very focused attention. It's still the only day in my entire life that I've been put in personal fear for my life. But it wasn't very widespread. The general public, then and now, is not, except for a very narrow segment, is not terrifically motivated one way or the other on gun questions.
That narrow segment, however, spent a lot of money to
Indeed they did. Indeed they did. But the fact is that if it hadn't been for the tax program and the distress that so many people around the state felt with respect to that because they didn't understand it or didn't accept it or didn't want to, that's why the spending of that money was effective. The fact of the money is, if you look at elections then and now, money by itself doesn't always do it. You've got a very well-funded candidates who will lose, and that's because the issue whatever the determinative issues are things that people really care about. In New Jersey in 1991, it wasn't the gun issue that really turned people on. It was the tax issue.
Or turned the people off, as the case may be.
Well, motivated them to vote as they did.
Right.
The gun piece was there, but if it had all been by itself, if we hadn't had to attack the school funding and the budget problem at the same time, Florio, in my opinion, then and now could easily have survived the gun bill.
One of the less focused on, that's poorly worded, let's try that again. One piece of the education reform package that people did not pay a lot of attention to, but which may have ended up being a political liability to the governor, was that piece that would have required local school districts to assume the cost of paying for pensions. And the NJEA became a vocal opponent of the entire education reform package as a consequence of that. Again, with 20/20 hindsight, knowing that the NJEA is a powerful lobby, that it has traditionally supported Democratic candidates and would, all things considered, have undoubtedly been supportive of Jim Florio in all the other aspects of the education reform package, might that have been a political miscalculation?
I think it was not a miscalculation in the sense that we knew the risks. And accepted them. Turned out they were, it was too high a price to pay. But in terms of how you structure the overall program and how you finance it, we couldn't do what the NJEA would have wanted us and needed us to do without a very significant adjustment on the other side on the financial end. And we were paying enough, too much, of a price on the financial end anyway. To do even more would, in our view, what we thought we were doing was minimizing the damage on both sides. And it turned out that the political calculation was wrong, but the programmatic calculation was not, in my view. If you look at what has happened since, when you add in all of the wonderful tax cuts that came in the 1990s thereafter, look at the status of public pensions today.
One of the early issues in regard to the Quality Education Act was that instead of waiting for the Abbott v. Burke decision to come down, the Florio team, in anticipation of it coming down, came out with the Quality Education Act. Would there have been, again, this is all 2020 hindsight, one of Tom Kaine's great successes was getting taxes increased by being dragged kicking and screaming to sign the legislation to increase the taxes rather than being out in front proposing them. Might Jim Florio have done better to have waited for the court to make its pronouncement on Abbott versus Burke, and then over a period of time gotten the legislature to push him to do the things that ended up being done?
Every time I hear a complaint about an activist court, and you hear that a lot from a certain political quadrant, I am reminded of the summer of 1976 when the New Jersey Supreme Court closed the schools and forced the legislature to act. And the New Jersey Supreme Court did so because for the previous 3 years, the New Jersey legislature had not acted in response to a prior order. And I remember thinking at the time and saying at the time, to those who criticized the New Jersey Supreme Court for being activist, all they did was to step into a vacuum that the legislature had created. That the public interest required action. The legislature had not acted, so the court did. Now, in answer to your question, Jim Florio, we didn't, by the way, anticipate by a lot. We knew the decision was coming. Everybody did. We didn't know the exact parameters and the exact requirements. We had to wait for those. But the main thrust of what the court was going to do was common knowledge on the street as well as in policy halls. So we started with that to exercise the leadership that we believed the people of New Jersey had asked Jim Florio to exercise. Would the whole political dynamic have been different if he had sat back and been passive and let the legislature work the process? Perhaps, but perhaps not. The experience that we had all seen in the 1970s was that the political process might not have allowed the legislature to actively engage and address and resolve the issues. Somebody has to lead. In New Jersey, our philosophy was, and mine still is, that's the governor. If the governor doesn't lead, nobody will. And I respectfully disagree with your description about Tom Kaine, whom I thought was a very good governor. And he and I have had this conversation on a number of occasions. If you want to make a lot of money, engage anybody you know in a wager to identify which governor of New Jersey is the only governor of New Jersey to have signed increases in the income tax, the sales tax, and the corporate business tax. And you will win that bet every time because they will give you Byrne, they will give you Florio, they will give you Corzine, they will give you any Democrat, but they will not give you the truth, which is Tom Kaine. And when I mentioned that to Tom the last time I saw him, he said, yeah, and he says, if you'd have sent me the gasoline tax, I'd have signed that too. The fact is, he wasn't dragged kicking and screaming. All of these things were done in the first 4 months of his administration. I was the majority leader at the time, and on another occasion, if you want, I'll tell you how that happened. But what he did masterfully, much, much better than Florio ever did, was to create exactly the mantra that you have just described. Now, he had a benefit that Florio did not. As it happened, Florio was not at fault. Kaine is not to be credited. It is what it is. In 1982, after Kaine asked the legislature for and got all of those tax increases, the next 4 or 5 years, in the early and mid-'80s, were a time of economic upswing and expansion. So he never, at any time for the rest of his 8 years in office, had to come back to the legislature for anything else. And when he ran for re-election in 1985, he could say with credibility, I did what I had to do then, haven't done anything of that nature since then, don't worry about it. And the mantra, the political benefit that he got from all of that was that he did what he was forced to do. But the fact is, he was sworn into office in January of 1982, and by the time I left to become a judge in July of 1982, all of those bills had been enacted at his instance, because we insisted that they be Republican-sponsored bills for all the obvious reasons.
You were not critical, that would be too strong a word. You were disappointed in the tax package that ultimately emerged in Brendan Burns' administration. You compared it once to Bill Cahill's, and you much preferred Cahill's because it was a graduated income tax on including deductions and so forth, which you rather than a gross income tax, and that those deductions you characterized as the ability to enact policy by having those deductions. When the Florio QEA came along and the Quality Education Act and the tax changes that were proposed as a consequence of that, it was still a gross income tax. Was there any attempt on your part or anybody else's to tinker with that at that time, or was that at that point so established in law that you weren't going to go back and
The answer is no, there was no attempt. The answer was it was firmly well established as a matter of policy. I would tell you today, with all of the wisdom of gray hair, that my focus on that in 1976 was still correct from a tax policy point of view. I still think that you can use a tax code, if you're smart enough, to accomplish a whole array of public policy purposes. But from a political point of view, the gross income tax was absolutely the best answer in 1976, which is why I voted for it. And to make significant policy changes or structural changes in it thereafter would have been politically unwise. So the answer is, if you're going to have a gross income tax, you have to come up with other ways in which you're going to make policy determinations that you want to make. For example, in New Jersey, we have the Senior Citizens Homestead Rebate Act. Well, in an ideal system, if you're a pure tax theorist, which nobody in public office ought to be, but if you're a pure tax theorist, you don't need a homestead rebate structure like that if you incorporate it as a deductible expense on an income tax structure.
But then the check doesn't bear the governor's signature.
That's right. From a among other things, that's right. And from a political point of view, the structure that was eventually devised, which was the gross income tax together with a series of other adjustments that people could see, had a great deal more political impact.
Let's talk a little bit about the tone of the first 6 months of the Florio administration. And again, I don't. When I raised the criticisms that arose, I please understand that I'm reporting.
We're doing history here. I understand.
Okay, all right. There was a lot made of the fact that there was a very small cadre around the governor that sort of reserved unto itself the right to make all the decisions. That you, Brenda Bacon, Carl Van Horn, Doug Berman, John Schuer. Where
Greg Lawler was in that group,
and Greg Lawler you were in there making all of the decisions, and you were viewed by the press and by some cabinet officers as being very insular.
Well, you've left out a number of other people who shared that view, and they were
legislators.
Some of them had the same view. Yes.
And you were responsible in large measure for relations with the legislature during this period of time. Is that an accurate criticism? Is it? Well, I guess maybe there's a two-part question. Is it an accurate criticism of the Florio administration? Is it in fact part and parcel of what the first few months of any governor's term are like?
A little of both. It's accurate in the sense, it's accurate and inaccurate in part. It's accurate in the sense that that group of people had the responsibility to engage this mammoth agenda and to do so quickly as politically was possible, and to do so efficiently and effectively. And as anybody who has ever managed any process of this type will tell you, that can't be done by committee. That's got to be done by leadership. And in this instance, that was the leadership quadrant. But it is inaccurate, at least with respect to those initiatives that required legislative input, which is nearly all of them, because we didn't do very much by executive order, except with respect to certain environmental things. It is inaccurate to suggest that we weren't working actively with the legislative leadership. We were working daily with the legislative leadership. We couldn't have accomplished any of what we did without that. When you're on the other side, when you're the Speaker or the Majority Leader or the President or the Majority Leader of the Senate or the other legislative leaders, and you see this group of insular people working 5 days a week when you're there 2 days a week, you can't help but feel that you're playing a lesser role. And to a certain extent, that's true. But it is not true that we didn't include the legislative leadership in every policy-making decision. In fact, we made had to and were willing to, make dramatic adjustments in what we were suggesting along the way because we got told on a given day, I can't get the votes for that. I can't get the votes for that. Well, what can you get the votes for? I can get the votes for this. Okay, let's try it that way. And that process was a daily process throughout it. So it's accurate and inaccurate at the same time. I would suggest, having watched closely the Byrne administration start, the Kaine administration start, and the Florio administration start, that what all three had in common was just that. A very small group of people who had responsibility to engage a very precise agenda and who did so as best they could in the political environment in which they operated. In Byrne's case, for example, I was, what was I? I was 1974. I was 28. I was 28. I was the chairman of the Assembly Taxation Committee. And I remember a series of meetings, 8 meetings. The state treasurer, counsel to the governor.
Dick Leone, Lou Caden.
Chairman of the Assembly Taxation Committee.
You.
Ranking Democrat on the Assembly Taxation Committee, whose legislative career was at that point 6 weeks old, Gordon McInnes. And I'm leaving 1 or 2 people out of the room, but I was the youngest one in the room at 28. Dick Leone was the oldest one in the room at 33. And I remember looking around at these meetings, where are the grown-ups? The fact is there were a couple of assistant counsel, Caden's counsel, younger. My point simply being that the leadership has to start in a small quadrant, and then you build from there. And every one of Kaine did the same thing. Kaine started with Lou Thurston and Justice Gary Stein. Those are the people that, now I was the majority, now it's under Kaine in '82, I'm the majority leader of the Senate. So I had even though I wasn't of their party, I had an obvious responsibility to work with them and talk with them in those years to shape a program. And when they got about the business of the governor's budget and the governor's taxes, I was in every meeting, as was Donnie DeFrancesco, who was the Republican minority leader. So there's always a mix between the governor's immediate staff and the outreach.
Was there any attempt to engage any of the Republican leaders in any of this conversation?
It varied issue to issue. On the automobile insurance, we had terrific dialogue and cooperation with the Republicans in both houses and got several Republican votes in both houses.
Actually, my recollection is that you had greater difficulty with the Democratic Insurance Committee chairman.
That's correct. That's absolutely right. The Republicans were very engaged and very helpful, and we made adjustments in the program to accommodate them. That's what political compromise in those days was all about. So on the auto insurance bill, it was a very good dialogue. On the gun bill, I still laugh all these years later.
Well, you had your Republican ally from Atlantic County on that one.
He was counting. He was counting on the fact that we would fail, as we did, that we would fail to engage any other Republican vote.
We're talking about Bill Gormley.
And I loved him dearly then, but it was important to him that he be the only Republican to vote for the bill, which it turned out eventually he was. We could not get any, and we made a significant effort. I was on the point man on that one, on the gun bill. Much more.
No pun intended.
Yeah, right. Much more so than on some of the others. And I was involved in every aspect of that. And made a Herculean effort to get some of the interest groups and some of the other public organizations to work with some of the Republican senators, and it just didn't work. And to Bill's delight, he wound up being the only vote that we got. On the school finance and budget bills, we went through the motions, but it was made very clear to us at the outset in both houses that there would be no Republican help. So we didn't have the opportunity or the responsibility, as I had done with Tom Kean some years before when we were in the Assembly together.
In the majority.
Well, in 1974 and in 76, when the Byrne tax program was going through, Tom Kean and I, that's where we developed our relationship. Tom Kean and I he was the Republican minority leader. I was the chairman of the Taxation Committee. We had any number of dialogues, and in fact, some aspects of the program, Tom eventually voted for that, together with a half a dozen other Republicans in 1976, because we had put some Republican-sponsored elements into the program, which we were more than willing to do in the Florio years, but couldn't get the Republicans to engage.
But there was some behind-the-scenes activity, wasn't there, in the Quality Education Act to do some changes of the formula that would benefit suburban districts?
Yes, and we did that with a frankly political agenda and motive to try to secure some of those votes. Now, some of those votes that we were getting in 1990 from what you call suburbia, which is accurate, were Democratic votes, because in the 1989 election we had elected some Democrats from what you and I would call suburban districts that would normally have voted Republican. So we were doing that in an effort to help those legislators, but also we went to the Republicans who were exactly similarly situated and said, look what we are prepared to do. And it didn't help very much.
One of perhaps the greatest symptom of this insularity that I spoke about before, you may recognize this
from the dinner, the legislative correspondence dinner. Yes,
this is a button that says "Ask Doug."
Right, that was the 1990 legislative correspondence.
Right. I actually found this cleaning out my basement the other day. That everybody who worked in the governor's office wore one of these to the Legislative Correspondence Club dinner, because at that time the big controversy was that Doug Berman, the state treasurer, was the only person from the Florio administration who was permitted to speak to the legislature's appropriations committee to talk about the budget.
That's correct.
A lot of cabinet officers bristled at that. A lot of the press made a big deal of that. Whose decision was that? Was that a unanimous decision? I've read somewhere that it was actually suggested by Larry Weiss, who was the chairman of the legislature's appropriations committee, though I don't know whether that's hindsight or not.
And I don't, all these years later, I frankly don't remember that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm saying I don't remember that it did. Whose decision was that? At the end of the day, that's an easy question to answer.
It was the governor's decision.
It was the governor's decision. But how he made it and whether we all concurred with that, the truth is I really don't remember on that point. The governor, every governor, as he or she should, has his own or her own leadership style. And one of the main substantive points that was in my mind as I was helping to shape and talk to the governor-elect about how his office would be organized had to do with his leadership style. Some people prefer what you might call a pyramid style. You have everybody coming up a chain, the chain gets smaller and smaller and eventually comes to a point and the governor's at the top. That's not the Jim Florio style. There's nothing particularly right or wrong with that style, it's just not how he worked. He worked on what I called the hub of the wheel style. He was in the middle, and out from him went all of the spokes. Doug Berman and Steve Perskie and Brenda Bacon and Carl Van Horn all had direct access to and contact with the governor, and according to the particular issue involved, or according to whether it was policy or politics or whatever, on a given issue on a given day, this spoke would have a lot more to say than that one. But Jim was always in the middle. Jim modeled his leadership style consciously, modeled his leadership style out of Franklin Roosevelt's model, which of course worked very well for him too.
Mm-hmm. Did he encourage dissension? Did he encourage a wide variety of opinions coming to him, or were you, the 4 or 5 or 6 of you who had that access, largely of the same mind when it came to these issues and how to deal with them?
We had a meeting one morning. I don't remember when. It would have been sometime during that craziness period. Craziness meaning January to June. Right. Staff meeting one morning, and at the end of the meeting, he said, "Wait for just a minute." To me. Everybody left, and he criticized me privately for not, because he knew that I was not happy with what I was hearing, that he was being told. Not quite sure how he knew it, maybe just by instinct, I don't remember. I don't remember what it was. But he criticized me for not speaking up and engaging a debate in front of him with the others on the issue. He said, when you disagree, I need to hear from you, and I need to hear from you in front of them.
Did you take that advice subsequently?
First of all, it was as much directive as advice, and secondly, it was good advice, and I had no choice but to take it, and of course I did, yeah. I mean, but what he wanted from us, he didn't, my point is, he didn't want me or anybody else coming, and I had never done it, so my suspicion is others had. He didn't want me coming into him privately after a meeting and said, you know, I disagree with Doug, I think you ought to do this. Mm-hmm. I had not done that. I had kept whatever disagreements I had to myself, and he was critical of me for not speaking out, and he said, you got something to say it, but say it in front of everybody.
So the advice that some people would have had, or the internal advice that some people would have had, which would have been, I'm going to pick and choose the fights that I'm going to pick. He didn't want that. No. He wanted you to just be out there all the time.
These are my words, not his. He wanted the best from each of us on every issue, that whatever we had, whatever we thought, he wanted to know it. If we didn't have a position on something, fine, then keep your mouth shut. But if you've got something that you think, I want to hear it. And then I, meaning the governor, I'll make the decision.
Right. The structure that we talked about earlier, that you were very involved in putting together, one of the early questions that arose, there had been an Office of Policy and Planning, I guess dating back to the Byrne administration and then the Kane administration. And in the early Florio administration, it was kind of bifurcated. Brenda Bacon was a policy advisor, I guess, or director of...
Director of Policy and Planning.
But then Carl Van Horn was the director of policy, and it was changed from the Office of Policy and Planning to the Office of Management and Planning, and and Greg Lawler was there as well. It seemed like it had 2 and sometimes as many as 3 heads. And I know, and I have to say from personal experience, that sometimes trying to figure out which of those 3 people you wanted to talk to, you couldn't quite figure it out.
How about trying to figure that out as the chief of staff? That was.
But this was your structure.
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
Sorry.
No. This was the practical manifestation of what I described a minute ago as the hub of the wheel. He wanted to hear directly from Carl Van Horn. He wanted to hear directly from Greg Lawler. He wanted to hear directly from Brenda Bacon. He didn't want whatever they had to say being filtered through anybody, through Steve Perskie, through Brenda Bacon, through whomever. So on any given day as the chief of staff, my life was, and I'm not complaining, I'm just describing, it was what it was. But my life, as well as the other lives, were much more difficult because we weren't entirely certain of who was saying what to him when. Because, and this is what I think led him to tell me what he said to me, in fact, I know that it was, if one of the others were going into him and telling him something, I wouldn't know about it. And maybe Doug Berman wouldn't know about it. Or if Doug Berman were going in, I wouldn't know about it or whatever. So that's why he said something to me, and I hope, and I frankly expect, I think he did, say to the others, you know, you need to share this. But it didn't work that way. As a practical matter, because of his desire to be in direct contact on any issues of significance during that period of time, there was something of a sense of chaos in that respect. Organizational chaos, not policy chaos.
No, well, I think, I mean, it was clear that Brenda Bacon was preeminent on healthcare issues and related issues, that Carl Van Horn was on education.
Correct.
And that Greg Lauer was on insurance, for example. But when it came to assault weapons, for example, or the budget, well, I guess Doug Berman would be the
and assault weapons there was mine.
Okay, so they did break down into
except that we all, at least nominally, we had all responsibilities for everything. Now each of us was on point on a different issue. Doug started out, even though his principal focus was the budget. Doug and Greg Lawler handled the auto insurance at the outset. The assault weapon was mostly mine. Brenda was healthcare, and as the months evolved and different things came up, it got spread out a little more.
Let's go back to the cabinet for a minute. When you were starting to get those phone calls in that office in Atlantic City, and you described the fact that at some point around August or September, people were going up to the candidate and saying, what job are you going to have for me?
Right.
Obviously, one of your jobs then was to be a buffer, but also to collect resumes and to sort of figure out who was going to go where.
That's absolutely right. I want to make sure you understand. Nobody assigned me, and I never expected that I had any decision-making authority on all this. I was in a committee, if you will. Doug Berman was very actively involved at that point. Brenda wasn't there yet, and this was not policy. From a political point of view, it was the people that were running the campaign. Genova was involved. Doug Berman was involved.
I guess Karen Kessler.
Karen Kessler was intimately involved in the process that I'm describing. I was a part of it, and I was administratively in charge of it, but not substantively.
What about when it actually came time to make those appointments? How involved were you at that stage?
They again varied. I'll make 2 points to make the point. One day, after whatever the discussions were, we were looking at possible attorneys general. And
that didn't take very long, as I recall.
It was one of the first. And he said to me, go see him for me. Because he knew that I had a relationship with
him
Bob.
Being Bob Del Tufo.
Because he knew that Bob and I had a relationship. So I called Bob and I said, need to have dinner with you. He was a lawyer down the street at the time, and we had a terrific dinner, and that's what happened. A few days or weeks later, I forget what it was, we're in a staff meeting one morning, and we're all in there, Karen and Doug and John Schur and me, and I don't remember who else.
This is still transition.
This is in transition. And he says, okay. He said, raise your hand if you know who I've decided to appoint as the special prosecutor in the Department of Environmental Protection. No hand went up. And he said, okay, he says, you're all on record that you don't know. And that's fine. And I didn't know, and I assumed everybody else was telling the truth also. And the purpose for that exercise was he was getting ready to announce it soon, and he didn't want to have any leaks. So
interesting.
It was a kind of a game.
And that was Steve Madonna, as I recall. Is that right?
The truth is, I think that's right.
And where did he come? I don't even
have
recall
no
where
idea.
he came from.
But my point in telling you the story all these years later is I had as much to do with that selection as you did. Whereas on the other hand, I was the one who was sent to get the Attorney General. Mm-hmm. Now, it varied from position to position. Judy Askin as DEP was a very complicated, very intricate process, not for any reason having to do with her talents or abilities, which were easily recognized, but the whole environmental issue was a humongous political subject that involved an awful lot of input.
Also an area in which Jim Florio had a considerable amount of policy expertise.
You bet. And one that he wasn't about to turn over to anybody. And I'm certainly not being critical. I respect that. That was, from his point of view, that was as important an appointment as any that we were dealing with in the transition. Mm-hmm. And similarly, some of them were, and I'm going to forget some of the names here anymore. It's all these years later, but some of them were his. George Zoffinger was his. Ray, who was later? Ray Bermucci was his. Some of the others were, go find me somebody who. I remember going to see Ed Koch. I told you a couple of minutes ago that in my first Senate campaign, I hired a young guy to be the pollster. Remember that? Mm-hmm. His name is Doug. His name was then and still is Doug Schoen, who has since gone on to a fabulous career. Well, Doug Schoen at that time was Ed Koch's personal assistant or pollster or whatever. And I called Doug and I said, I need to meet with Ed Koch. And I went up with somebody else from the staff, I forget who, and spent a couple of hours one afternoon in City Hall in New York with Ed Koch to effectively ask him, he was just ready to leave office, Dinkins had been elected, and I was shopping. I said, you got somebody that has served you well in any particular position that might be interested in being considered for a position in New Jersey's cabinet? And somebody came out of that. All these years later, I don't remember who, but at least one of the names came out of that.
That's interesting. We're going to have to research that because I
there's
don't
somebody
recall
that,
somebody
there's
who
somebody
came out
that
of
did. But my point is that with all of those positions, I think there were 16 or 17 cabinet positions, mm-hmm. whatever it was. The process was different for each one of them. The banking was also one that I paid some attention to.
I don't recall who that was.
All I remember is the deputy, because the deputy was a friend of mine.
Uh-huh. You, at some point, midway through 1990, had you decided you had enough of this nonsense after a few months? I mean, it was obviously a very, very trying
I've said it all
time.
These years later. You know the story about a dog's life? A dog's life is equivalent to 7 years of a human life.
Those 6 months were equivalent to...
Yeah, they were. It was a bunch of different things at the same time. I was smack in the middle of the most exciting, the most important issues facing 8 million people. I had a major place at the table. I didn't get everything I wanted, but I was in the middle of the most interesting, most important, most exciting issues that were going on in the entire society. Nobody with my DNA couldn't have gone home at night and said, oh man, I am the luckiest person I know. And I did, and I was.
You were also probably one of the most exhausted people.
At the same time, it was exhausting in every sense of the word. I had a driver. I would get up, leave the house at 7:50. On the day we didn't have staff meetings, I would leave the house at 7:15 in the morning. They had a new invention in those days. There was actually, in the state police car that I rode in, there was a telephone. You know, those other things, they didn't exist. There was a phone in the car. I would get into the car at 7:15. I would drive. I would get to the State House about 8:45, and I was working that whole hour and a half, either on the phone or doing whatever. I would get out of the car at 8:45, 9 o'clock in the morning, and feel like I had worked a half a day already, and work the whole day. And then you get into the car at 7 o'clock at night, and you go home. It's 8:30 at night, and you have dinner, and then you go to sleep. It was exhausting physically, it was exhausting emotionally, it was exhausting politically, it was everything you could imagine. But at the same time, it was just that great. Now, it's June. We get the budget. The budget was the last piece. And we are all exhausted. Now it's time to take stock. So July, Doug does the polling, and we take stock, and we concluded collectively and individually. We had done some terrific things. We had done some wonderful things. We had accomplished some fabulous results, and we had butchered the politics. We were in deep political difficulty, and we knew it. So starting in July, it becomes a question of, okay, how do we manage this process? What do we do about it? Now, you're getting ready to ask me about me, so I need to back up 1 minute. I bring to this exercise from the very beginning all that I have from the perspective of the state of New Jersey, but I also bring to it a son of Atlantic County. I also bring to it the man whose obituary, when it is written, will be headlined Casino Control Act. I bring to it the perspective in the transition period that the agenda in Atlantic City has been brutally damaged during the past 8 years of my friend Tom Kane's administration. And he is my friend, was then, is now. And did a great job as governor, but not for Atlantic City. And that the entire Atlantic City agenda needs a complete rethinking, restructure, refocus. Jim Florio is on board with that. Says to me, go. Put the plans together, take as much time as you need, and then after that we'll find out how we're going to do it.
So had you spent time during the first 6 months actually?
I delegated it
Okay.
to Jack Sweeney, my dear friend and counsel to the governor. Jack was delegated by me in January. Go talk to everybody there is to talk to the casinos, talk to the commission, talk to the division, talk to everybody that there is, and then bring me back a comprehensive plan. What kind of changes do we need in the statute? What kind of changes do we need in the administrative regulations? What kind of changes do we need in personnel? What do we have to do? The chairman of the Casino Control Commission had retired in December, and I said to Florio, don't be in a hurry. The woman who's in charge, the then vice chair, Valerie Armstrong, I've known her a long time. She's very good. She can run this place. Leave her alone. We'll get one of your most important appointments is going to be chairman of the Casino Control Commission. You don't have to do it now. Let's get the agenda first. Then we will find somebody. And Florio was fine with that. Among other reasons, it was certainly not nearly as important an item as guns, right, automobile insurance. So all during the spring, Jack Sweeney is doing his thing with his staff. He's consulting with me. I'm aware of what's going on. I'm meeting on occasion when I had the time. They'll call me in. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Because I knew something about it.
As author of the Casino Control Act.
And as somebody who had paid very close attention all along. In any event, sometime by June, maybe July, here comes a complete agenda. These are the things we have to change in the statute. These are the things we have to change in the manner and regulatory systems. These are the whole bunch of things. And now there's the old vacancy from last December, and there's a new vacancy. Every August there's a new vacancy in the commission. So it's August. We are all conscious of the political difficulty we're in. Jim calls me in one day. Actually, he didn't. Yeah, he did. It was two conversations. He calls me into the office one day. And he said, look, he said, I'm thrilled. I'm paraphrasing now. These are not quotes. I'm thrilled with what we've done. You've done a spectacular job. Everything that we asked you to do, you've done. Now I need you to do something different. I want you to go to Atlantic City and take the Casino Control Commission. And I want to bring in Joe Salima, his political operative whom he had known and trusted all of his political career. And he says, I want Joe Salima to take over the politics. And I drove home.
What was your first reaction?
I drove home to tell my wife. And that's how I can answer your question, because I remember the conversation I had with my wife. I had a whole bunch of reactions. The first one, I think, probably was anger and disappointment. The second one was immense relief. The third one was, oh my goodness, I never thought about the Casino Control Commission for myself, and I didn't. I was planning this for somebody. I didn't have as a matter of fact, I did have a candidate. I had a candidate, a local lawyer in Atlantic City, a retired judge that I had known all my life, and I had actually spoken to him. He reminded me of this a year or so ago. I had actually spoken to him that spring. If I can pull it off, would you be interested in running the commission? And he thought about it for a couple of days and told me no. In any event, I went through...
How different history might have been if he had said yes.
Indeed, indeed. Well, there's a fourth piece of it. Because at this point, which is now August of 1990, I have been to the top of the mountaintop in terms of state policy, and what was clear to us all, and certainly to me, in August of 1990 was that the next 3 years were going to be about the politics of being the governor and the politics of getting reelected. Matters that I've never been all that great at. Retail politics has never been my long suit. I got myself elected 5 times. Actually, I got myself elected 4 times. I was elected the first time. I got myself elected the last 4. But in terms of retail politics, that's never been my long suit. I could always handle legislative politics, and I did that year. And I was handling my own politics. But politics on a global scale, politics on a statewide basis, that was not my thing.
You never had aspirations for any other?
Never. I encouraged people to put my name in a column somewhere because it was flattering and did me good, but I never had the slightest interest. The only statewide campaign I ever ran was the casino referendum, and I enjoyed that, but it reinforced my desire not to have to do that for a living. Anyway, by August of 90, I now have several decisions to make. Not only do I want to go to the Casino Control Commission, but do I even want to stay in government? Because at that point, I'm still looking ahead. My sons are now getting ready to get out of high school.
This job doesn't pay.
This job doesn't
much.
pay. I don't have the resources. Do I want to stay in government? I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anybody else. But some people who know me well enough know this too. There was only one reason at that point, having accomplished everything I could in 3 branches of government, and no intention of going back to the legislature or to stay where I was. Only one reason for me even to think about staying in government. And that was whatever possibility might ever exist that all of the stars would align for a position on the state Supreme Court, where my grandfather had sat. That was something that, if it had ever been presented, again, nobody with my DNA could ever have said no.
You're reinforcing speculation that has taken place from time to time.
Clearly, if anybody had ever said to me, would you like to do that, the answer would have been yes, no matter what my family and I would have had to do about being able to afford that lifestyle. Anyway, so he comes along and says, I want you to take the Casino Control Commission, and I said, okay, give me a couple of days. And he was, I couldn't have asked for more from him. He was a professional, he was friendly, he recognized, he went out of his way in a number of instances to recognize and to tell people that he recognized the contributions that I had made. At the end of the day, all these years later, while I have never taken the point of view that I am the only person that could have done any particular thing, that isn't ever the case, I know that the success of getting all of those things through the legislature in that fashion, in that time, I had a very significant hand in, and I'm quite proud of that. It's not that somebody else couldn't have done it, but I did do it. Anyway, a couple of days later, he calls me up. I've got a friend is having a reception for me in Longport, which is the town next to me, tomorrow night. And he says, do you mind if I stop at your house and talk to you? I said, great, because he knew I wanted to sleep on it a bit. Anyway, the next day he comes to the house, and we had a very nice chat. I told him I would take the Casino Commission, but I needed to know from him a couple of things. First of all, I reinforced what I had already confirmed, that the agenda that I had put together with Jack Sweeney he was very comfortable with. I said, if I do this, I'm going to be very aggressive on that agenda, and I need to know in advance if you have any concerns or problems, because I'm going to be telling people that I am acting in perfect consonance with your policy. No problem at all. Anything that's on that you need to do, you go ahead and do. I'll back you up. Furthermore, if there's something that you need to do, or you conclude that you need to do that isn't in that agenda, talk to me first and make sure that I understand it and I'm okay with it. And then whatever it is that we decide, you got it. So I went to the Casino Control Commission with I don't want to say a blank check. It wasn't a blank check, but it was a fully endorsed check. I had the governor and every member of the cabinet that I needed, which was the Treasury, which was DEP, I did leave one important thing out. Part of what the agenda that the governor had done was to set up an inter-cabinet committee headed by George Zoffinger to address Atlantic City issues. He had DEP in there, he had banking in there, he had the Attorney General, he had everybody that had anything to do with the development of Atlantic City, not just the casinos, working with the new mayor of Atlantic City, Jim Whalen. And the purpose of that was to engage state government in a way and at a level that hadn't been done in the previous 8 years. He committed to me that he would keep that going and that I would be actively involved with that. He agreed to my suggestion that we put me as the chairman of the Casino Control Commission on the CRDA.
Casino Redevelopment.
Casino Reinvestment Development Authority. The governor has an appointment, governor appoints a member of the Casino Control Commission to serve as a member of the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority. He agreed with my request that we change the leadership of the CRDA because that was going to become a very, very active player in this agenda, and that I would be involved in the selection of all of the leadership and the staff of that. So I went into the Casino Control Commission in October of 1990 with as total and as complete a gubernatorial mandate as anybody could have wished for, and it was obvious to the world. I mean, here I came from that position to this position. Here everybody knew that the governor had shaped an agenda that I was now going to exercise, so that when I spoke with the voice of the governor, which everybody knew, which meant that in 1991, 1992, 1993, and in 1994, each year, I could go to the legislature as the chairman of the Casino Control Commission, and I did each year, and I said, these are the changes that we want in the legislation. And the legislature gave us everything that we asked for.
Even those last 2 years that were Republican
Absolutely.
dominated.
Chuck Haitayan was fine with me on that. It also meant that when I restructured all of the regulations of the Casino Control Commission, which I did during those years, the governor, who eventually has the sign-off on any regulations of any state agency, as long as I was on the program, which I never varied from, he was fine with that. It meant that when I needed Bob Del Tufo's help as the Attorney General with respect to a problem that here or there I might have had with the Division of Gaming Enforcement, that was easy. And then eventually, by the way, Jack Sweeney came in from the governor's office. When Joe Salima came in as chief of staff, he wanted to bring Andy Weber in as counsel to the governor. So Jack Sweeney moved over to become director of the Division of Gaming Enforcement before he went on the bench. So it was a fabulous political environment for me for 4 years at the Casino Control Commission. And in those 4 years, we managed to execute the entire agenda that the governor's office had put together.
Then you went out and made some money.
Then I went out and made some money. Then I went out in 1994. The governor had been defeated for re-election. And just as a PS, because I told you that he never missed an opportunity to tell me how much he appreciated what I had done. Still doesn't when I see him now. I called him the day after the election. I told him that I had watched him on television that night. And one of the things that he had said, and that was 1993, this is now a couple of months, it'll be 20 years, how clearly I still remember, that he said to the public that night, I'll paraphrase it, but the essence of it was, I don't feel sorry for myself as much as I do for all of the people who would have had opportunities in a second term that I can't now provide. Something like that. And I called him the next day to tell him how gracious I thought his remarks were and how proud I was of him, and that remark in particular. And he said to me, he probably said it to some others as well, and that's fine, but he said to me, I had you in mind when I said that. You can read into that whatever you would like, but that's what he said. So in any event, yes, I then told Christine Whitman, I went to see her transition people to tell them that whatever they needed from me at the Casino Control Commission in terms of research or whatever, and they did ask over the next few months They did ask for some help on some stuff. Which
And you had a relationship with Hazel Gluck from the time that you were in the legislature together, for example.
Absolutely right. Hazel was a good friend and somebody that I could easily talk to, and did. And in fact, Hazel's dear friend had been, before I got to the Casino Control Commission, Hazel had had a legislative aide and a dear friend of hers who she had placed in a position, a staff position at the Casino Control Commission. And had become, by the time I was there, she was the director of affirmative action, I think. On the day after Florio's defeat, on the day that Whitman was elected, excuse me, the staffer walked into my office and said, "I'm resigning, I'm going to work in the governor's office." And that's fine. That just meant I had another contact in Whitman's office. And then eventually, in the spring, I still had a year and a half to go on my term at the Casino Commission. But I knew that when the opportunity was presented, I would take advantage of it. I went and took the Pennsylvania bar exam, just in case I wanted the option of practicing law with a firm in Philadelphia. I passed it, by the way. And then
After all those years.
Indeed. And by the way, I still remember when I looked around the room, I took the exam in the convention hall in West Philadelphia, next to Penn. And there were, I don't know, at least 2,000 people in the room, I would think. And at one point, I just stood up to look around, and I was, by a large margin, I was the oldest person in the room.
Come a long way from the days when you were the youngest person in the state legislature.
Now all of a sudden I was the oldest. How old was I? 94, so I was 49 years old. I got a job offer with a dear friend of mine who had left the law practice in Atlantic City a couple of years before and had gone to work as the president of a casino company in Louisiana and in Illinois at the time. And I became general counsel, and I spent 2.5 years there getting myself out of debt, which I did successfully. And then I came back to Atlantic City in the end of '96 and went into the law practice.
You joined the Perskie law?
Actually didn't at the time.
Oh, you didn't?
I joined a larger firm, since known as Fox Rothschild. My cousin's firm was too small and they didn't have space for me then. I spent 5 years practicing law, and then I got, my kids were out of school by then. I had paid for it. And I went to see Donnie DeFrancesco. Actually, first I went to see Christine Whitman. This is 2000. Went to see Christine Whitman, said, "I'd like to go back on the bench." She said, "Okay." Then she decided that her attention was going to be focused on some other election, something to do with Washington and somebody named Bush. I forget the details, but when the dust all settled, and Gore went away, she became commissioner or administrative director of EPA. So Donnie DeFrancesco now is the governor. So I have to go back, and Donnie, I'd like to be a judge again. Okay. I'm sitting here mindful. You just need to understand what I'm trying to tell you. I became a judge the first time because I walked into the governor's office, who was a Republican and friend of mine, and said, "I'd like to be a judge," and he said, "Okay." And then 7 years later, he reappointed me. Then the next time, I walked into the governor's office, a Republican who wasn't as close a friend, but nevertheless was quite cordial, and said, "I'd like to be a judge." She said, "Okay." And she didn't get it done. So I walked in the next time. Actually, didn't even walk into his office. He was at a conference in Atlantic County, and I called and I said, "I'd like to see you." He said, "Sure, come on over." So I went over in Galloway Township. He was at the Smithville Inn, and we sat in the corner, and I said, "Donnie, I'd like to be a judge again." He said, "Okay." So whenever I read about all of the difficulties that lawyers have of becoming judges, and that the definition of a judge, somebody once told me, is a lawyer that knew the governor, I am mindful of the fact of how lucky I am. I went to see 3 different people, all of them Republicans, all of whom I had a personal relationship with, and said, "I'd like to be a judge," and they said, "Okay." And that's how my judicial career got done.
And what happened? And you were then reappointed?
I was reappointed by Donnie DeFrancesco at the end of 2001. Served 7 years, was reappointed by John Corzine, who I had met once or twice, but didn't have any type of a personal or political relationship with. But when you're up for reappointment as opposed to initial appointment, it's a different animal. Mm-hmm. And he reappointed me. And I have on my wall, somebody presented to me, I have it's rather large because it's 4 letters from 3 different governors, 1982, 1989, 2001, 2008. 4 different letters, 3 different governors appointing me as a judge, and there aren't that many people with those 4 letters.
Mm-hmm. And what are you doing now?
I worked as a judge until I retired in February of 2010. Then I went back.
You hadn't reached the mandatory retirement age.
Not mandatory, no, but permissive. I was eligible for a pension. I still, even after all those years, I still enjoyed being a judge, but there were no mountains to climb. By the time I finished, I had worked in every division of the court. I had tried every case from a landlord-tenant case to a capital murder. I had tried cases in 4 different counties. I very much enjoyed the work. I very much enjoyed the people, but there was nothing left for me to do that I hadn't done before.
And you figured maybe it was finally time to go and join the Perskie law firm after all these years?
Then I went back and went to my cousin with whom I had originally been a partner once many years before and said, I'm ready. He said, okay. I am with the firm as of counsel. I do a little bit of legal work. I'm not allowed to appear, as a retired judge in New Jersey, I'm not allowed to appear in a New Jersey court or before a New Jersey agency. But I can be involved with preparing litigation, with helping with the clients, with doing the pre-trial work. I do a lot of that. I do some commercial transaction work. Most of what I do, though, and what I really absolutely love doing, is I serve as a mediator and an arbitrator in an effort to either keep people from or get people out of the world that I enjoyed for so long, the court system. My role is to try to resolve cases before trial or even before they get filed, or to decide cases that have already been filed. I serve as a mediator, as an arbitrator in many instances. And I love that work. Frankly, without trying to brag, I'm pretty good at it.
Is this alternative dispute resolutions?
Yes.
This Sandy, Jaffe, Linda, Stamato stuff?
I don't do it in any formal structure in terms of being a member of any ADR group. I do it as a private attorney who is available to mediate any type of matter. In the 3.5 years I've been doing it, I've done commercial transactions, I've done automobile accident cases, I've done breakup of a business, breakup of a family. Over the years I've touched so many different types of cases that I can bring some pretty good experience to it. I just finished a case involving 35 lawyers, 66 different parties, and I negotiated a settlement among them that's in excess of $6 million. And it took 8 or 9 months to accomplish. So I'm quite pleased with what I've been able to do.
Let me ask you, from this position now of having had all of these different experiences, to make a couple of general observations about the governorship of New Jersey. Having watched several governors from a distance, then having been intimately involved in the Florio administration, and to a certain extent, certainly knowing how the front office worked in other administrations, what general observations could you make about, well, let's start with the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches of government in New Jersey?
The quote that I have frequently made to people that they need to understand, when you explain that the governor of New Jersey is constitutionally uniquely empowered in the United States. There is no governor anywhere in the United States with as much theoretical or constitutional power as has the governor of New Jersey. There is no other statewide elected official in state government. Other states elect, well, now there is a lieutenant governor, but that's not quite the same as it is elsewhere. No, we don't elect attorney general, we don't elect secretary of state, we don't elect judges. Only the governor is elected statewide. And the quote
and the governor appoints all those other people.
Indeed, and the governor's appointing power in New Jersey is dramatically more expansive and extensive than in other states. And the comment that I've made over the years is that a governor of New Jersey, no matter who he or she is, can always prevent a legislature from doing something that the governor doesn't want done. A given governor may or may not be able to persuade a legislature to do what the governor wants done, but the governor always has the ability, no matter who he or she is, no matter how politically skilled or not, always has the ability to stop a legislature from an initiative that the governor doesn't want. I learned that, among other things, when Governor Cahill didn't want gambling for Atlantic City. The essence...
just to stop you for a second, I mean, there are certain things that the legislature did in this the last 2 years of the Florio administration that Jim Florio didn't want to have done, but they had a veto-proof, the Republicans had a veto-proof majority.
And even with that, he was able to effect some adjustments in the substance of that. But yeah, that's true. But you know,
not that happens very. I mean, it hasn't happened before.
I'm just going to say, if you look at the last, well, since the 1947 Constitution, if you look at the number of years in which any governor of New Jersey was faced with a 2/3 majority in the legislature of the opposite party, you just don't see that.
It's happened for 2 years.
Well, no, right? It didn't. No, it didn't. If you remember correctly, that was the Assembly. The Senate was still Democrat at that time. So that's what I meant. The Assembly was indeed overwhelmingly Republican, but in the 92 and 93 sessions after the 91 election, you still had a Democrat majority in the Senate. Which is what I meant when I said that he was able to effect some changes in what they attempted to do. Wasn't able to stop it all, but he was able to shape it to a certain extent. And that's the critical reality. The thing that differentiates one governor from another at the end, after it's all done, is not so much what policies they advance or oppose, as much as it is what they can persuade first the legislature and then the people of New Jersey to accept. Florio's strength and failing is in the same place. Florio's strength was in his ability to persuade the legislature to accept what he defined as public policy. And his failure was in his inability to sell it to the people of New Jersey. Keynes, on the other hand, Keynes was 2 for 2. Keynes was able to persuade the legislature, even his own party, and there's a good story about that one, to do what he needed done. And then, partly by reason of the economic upturn, but nevertheless as a result of his political abilities, was able to sell it to the people of New Jersey. Brendan Byrne similarly. Brendan Byrne failed in his first term to persuade the legislature of what he needed to do. But in the end, in 1977, persuaded the people. And as a result of having persuaded the people, in his second term, could persuade the legislature of anything that he wanted.
Including the Pinelands Act,
including the Pinelands Act.
Which he still considers to be his greatest accomplishment.
I understand that.
What could Florio have done? Is there anything that Florio could have done differently in terms of the power of persuasion? Is it Jim Florio's personality? Is it did it have to do with communication skills? Did it have to do with what happened to the economy over those last couple of years?
There's one other
101.5.
Right. Well, all of that is a piece of it. But to answer that question fairly, you have to start at the other end and work backwards. He lost the election. That's in 1993. That's the reality, and it's that reality that defines all of these questions and all of these points of focus. But a closer look at that tells you that he lost that election in 1993 by 27,000 votes, which by any stretch of the imagination then or now is paper thin. And the case can be made, I have seen it made, and I've heard it made, that if he had handled this particular political problem, having nothing to do with the guns, having nothing to do with the taxes, if he had handled this particular county chairman in a different fashion, or if he had gone to that particular chairman's fundraiser instead of sending somebody else in this county and that county, and I've got 2 particular counties in mind, one of which I am sitting in.
I thought that might be the case.
You can make 27,000 votes, okay? Because if you look carefully at the numbers, Whitman's numbers were on a line with where they should have been. Florio's were down because the turnout was not what it could have been. And the turnout could have been much higher in places where Florio could have made 27,000 votes. So the first reality is he lost the election. That, you can't move off of that. But that, if you start with that, then you run the risk of saying, okay, he lost the election because of the guns. He lost the election because of the taxes. He lost the election because of his personality. Any of those things. The real truth is, it's a combination of a lot of it, but all of it was, what would have happened, for example, if he had gone to that county chairman's fundraiser, or if he hadn't alienated this particular county chairman? What would have been the analysis if he had 28,000 more votes than he did? Okay? He might not have won the Profiles in Courage Award. No, all I'm saying is you got to start and end with the fact that he did lose it. But the question of why he lost it and how he lost it is a lot more difficult than over the years people have given it credit for.
I think that pretty much runs through all the questions that I had. Are there any other general?
The only other point I'll tell you, just to make some of the point I was making about the governor and how he deals with the legislature. In the early Kane months, when he needed to put a budget together that would pass, he needed to raise taxes to make that budget pass, he needed, from his point of view, to get all of the ugly stuff out of the way as fast as he could, all of which he succeeded masterfully in doing. I served as the majority leader of the state Senate, and the Democrats had control of both houses. Now here's a governor of the opposite party coming to the legislature and saying to the legislature, I want this budget and I want those tax increases. How did he do that? I'll tell you how he did that, at least in terms of the Senate. There were, at the time, 23 Democratic senators and 17 Republican senators. You needed 21 votes to pass a bill. I sat with Gary Stein, who was the governor's chief counsel and who was and Lou Thurston, and they were delegated to deal with me and with the Senate president. And I told them what the Democratic caucus had decided. I said to them, we've got 23 Democrats, you've got 17 Republicans. We will give you 6 votes. That means you're going to need 15 Republicans. And we're being generous to give you 6 because we could give you 4. But we'll give you 6. Now, governor's people said to me, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. We've already talked to a lot of your guys, and we've got a lot more than 6 people who are ready to vote for us. I said, I know you do, but you're going to get 6 votes. And the assembly leadership told them exactly the same thing. My point, and that's indeed what happened at the end. They had to get, and they did get, 15 Republicans to go with our 6 Democrats. Now, yeah, if it had been a secret ballot, would we have had more than 6 people who would have been willing to vote for that program? Yes, we would have. But it was all political. And we were prepared to do what we had to do politically to enable the government to function. But we were insistent on doing it from a Democratic point of view to our best advantage. That meant making those tax increases Republican tax increases, even though we controlled the legislature. Now, that was the environment in 1982. Both sides did what they had to do politically, but cooperated to pass a program that they both considered important. In 2013, that couldn't have happened.
Well, I'm not. Let me be a little devil's advocate here. I think you could argue that that's what happened with the Affordable Care Act. That, in fact, they needed 51 votes to get it through the Senate.
It did.
And, I mean, a lot of the horse trading was with fellow Democrats and not necessarily across the aisle. But
you're right. You're right. That one would be the exception that proves the rule.
That's the only one that I can think of in modern times that would fall into that category.
You're right.
But
I think that is the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the very kind of horse trading that people who have gone to see the movie Lincoln talk about. The 2 things you don't want to see being made are sausage and laws.
That's right.
And that, in fact, one of the questions that arises these days is, because of so much transparency, has it made governing that much more difficult?
I suggest not. Just again, to give you a little bit of, I've always considered this remarkable. because of the sea change as fast as it was. I'm a freshman assemblyman in 1973, my second year. I'm sponsoring a bill to permit a constitutional referendum to allow casinos in Atlantic City that the governor doesn't want and that the Republican majority in both houses doesn't want. But it's my bill. I finally managed, after a year of effort, to persuade the chairman of the assembly committee to which the bill was assigned to entertain the bill. And I go in there, and and there's all kinds of media there, there's newspapers and whatnot, and I make my case in favor of the bill, and I don't remember whether I brought anybody else in to testify or not, whatever. And then, this is 1973, the committee excuses me, excuses everybody else, excuses the media, and in private and in secret debates the bill and votes not to release it. To this day, I don't know what the vote was. All right? Now, 24 months later, with the legislature and the governor having switched positions, we forget the casino bill, we pass virtually unanimously the bill that's now known as the Sunshine Act, okay, that applies to every level of government in New Jersey and prohibits that kind of nonsense. But my point is that that's how fast the world can change. Even after all of the transparency, you're able, if you know what you're doing and you're properly motivated, you can make public policy. It doesn't have to be made in secret. Some of the deals, yes. Some of the deals you have to do, not from a corrupt point of view and not from a individual agenda point of view, but rather because it's to your political advantage to be appearing, to be bludgeoned into something or whatever. It's not unhealthy to have certain kinds of private discussions, but the transparency does not interrupt good policy making if there is a sufficient level of commitment on both sides of the aisle to do it.
Getting back to the 6 votes that you promised, I'm intrigued by this because anybody reading the transcript or watching this is going to say, okay, I understand why the Democrats would say this has to be a Republican bill, but number one, where did you come up with the number 6? Number 2, how would you have decided at that point which 6 would be the ones who would cast the votes?
You gave them six guys that were in safe districts. You gave them the 4 from Hudson and maybe Camden and Revere. You took 6 people who couldn't possibly have any downside political consequence from a yes vote.
And is that in the Democratic caucus? Would there have been 6 people who would have raised their hands and said, "Yes, I'll volunteer to be that person"?
Okay. We had more than 6. We had to prevent a couple of guys who would have been willing to vote for it. We had to tell them, "No, you can't." Okay. And where did the 6 come from? Because we were, as far as I was concerned at the time, as the majority leader, and this was a carefully debated issue within the Democratic caucus. How many are we going to give them? Because there were some who said, give them 4. Make sure that every single Republican in the Senate votes yes. And frankly, that's where we started. We started with, we'll give you 4. Eventually, and we knew, of course, that we wouldn't hold to that. And eventually we yielded to 6 because there were 2 Republicans that were prepared to put a sharp stick in Tom Kaine's eye. Okay? No matter what you do, Tom Kaine, as your fellow Republican, I'm not going to do it. Well, okay. So they came to us eventually.
And you knew that from back channel conversations,
all of this was,
or this was fairly obvious?
Yeah, it was. I mean, these were not secrets. These were open. I mean, you knew who was available. I mean, Bill Gormley, for example, on the gun bill. There was no secret about that. Everybody knew he couldn't wait to vote.
Well,
for
as
that.
You say, he was champing at the bit to
exactly,
be the one.
Exactly. So eventually, we negotiated that we would give them 6, and they would only have to produce 15. But that's it. They wanted 12. Their position was they had 12 Republicans that they were okay with. They wanted 9 votes from us. And I told them at the very beginning, there is no way you're going to get it. Well, we know that there are 9 guys in your caucus that favor this. I said, yeah, there are, but they're not going to vote for it.
It would still have been a Republican bill. It would have still been 12 Republicans.
That was the political price that we exacted. And I'm not embarrassed about that now, and I wasn't embarrassed about it then, because beyond our narrow political agenda, which I confess to, we were prepared then to do what we had to do to implement the governor's policy initiatives. This is what the governor wants. Okay, we're going to let him do it. we're going to let him do it on our political terms, but we're going to give it to him. In Washington today and in Trenton today, you don't have that. You have, this is what the president wants, we're going to stop it. You had the majority leader or the minority leader of the United States Senate last year announce to the United States that his main political objective for the year was to prevent the election of the president, as opposed to pass this or that or the other kind of policy legislation. And I consider that to be an absolute disgrace. And it's not just limited to Mitch McConnell. I mean, it's the way of the world on both sides of the aisle in the whole political process now.
I keep thinking we've come to a logical end, and then there's another question that always seems to arise. Let me try this one out. You had mentioned that in your negotiations with the legislature over taxes, guns, etc., you had a very receptive audience in the assembly, which was, as I recall, Joe Doria was the speaker.
Correct.
And
Wayne Bryant was the majority leader.
I'm sorry, who was?
Wayne Bryant was the
Wayne Bryant was the majority leader. You had greater difficulty in the Senate where John Lynch was the Senate president. Were these personality differences? Were these purely political differences? Were these policy differences?
They were not personality. John Lynch couldn't have been more personally accommodating and more friendly and more helpful where the political and the policy issues permitted. So it was certainly not personality. It was a combination of mostly political, some policy. The Democratic Senate caucus was much more reserved. I don't want to say conservative because then people say conservative liberal, and that's not what I mean. They were much more reticent to do risky or dangerous things. That's what I mean by conservative.
No, that's so interesting because usually the political calculus is that the Senate has more opportunity to be that way because their terms are longer, they're a more deliberative body, and it's the lower house that has to run constantly that is more reserved in doing anything.
Well, remember in 1990 that the entire legislature, both houses, were up the next year. So while you're generally right that with a 4-year term you have more of a perspective difference, in this instance everybody was a 2-year term. But also...
That's a quirk we should point out of the fact that New Jersey holds its elections in odd-numbered years, and therefore the census, which requires a recalculation of the legislative districts, requires a...
Right. Three elections in a 10-year cycle. You have a 2, 4, and a 4. Also, you've got, though, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's the case in Trenton. It has been since I've been looking. It's the case in Washington. Less so in Washington, interestingly enough. As a general rule, and let's limit ourselves to Trenton. As a general rule, senators in Trenton are older than assembly people and been around politics longer. You have fewer rookies elected to the Senate than you have to the General Assembly. Legislative rookies, I mean. That's good and bad. If you've been around a long time, depending on what your politics are and what kind of a district you come from, it has an effect on the way you see things. For example, if you're in what's generally considered a safe district, if you're in a majority Republican district and you're a Republican, or if you're in a majority Democrat district and you're a Democrat, you tend to be, generally speaking, more willing to take some risks because you've got more political capital, you think, to spend. Whereas, as a general rule, if you're a Republican in a Democrat district or vice versa,
or in those few competitive districts,
if there is such a thing anymore, you tend to be, for the most part, a little more politically reticent. That's one of the things that has intrigued me all along, did then, does now, about myself. And you know the story.
That as a rookie assemblyman, you were anything but reticent.
Right, and for all the reasons that you know already, I was always a Democrat in a Republican district. The district is still a Republican district. It has recently elected and re-elected and just re-elected a Democrat as a senator. But for the most part, it's a Republican district, has always been. But in my case, I was able to defy the odds. And there's a long story about that, only a small part of which has anything to do with my talent.
A little thing called Watergate had something to do with that.
That was a part of it. That was very much a part of it. And you know the story about the accidentally telling the truth and then telling...
With respect to your vote on the income tax.
Right. But For the most part, members of the Senate, even if they're from what are perceived outside to be safe districts, tend to be somewhat less willing to run political risks. I'm not sure I can explain that. It's part of the culture. But for all of the years that I've been watching, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, even recently, my experience or the experience I've seen suggests that you've got more risk takers in the Assembly than you do in the Senate. Good, bad, or indifferent, that just seems to be the rule.
Steve Perskie, lawyer, judge, legislator,
Regulator.
chief of staff to the governor, regulator. Thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure.